Welcome, everyone. We're so glad that you could join us for our session on nurturing the reader in every child. We would like to begin our time today by introducing you to a character from an adventure story. Meet Cyrus Paltons, a British officer who has been captured along with 4 of his compatriots by an evil master in the mysterious Valley of India. Paltons and his fellow captives have been caged and are being wheeled to meet their almost certain death. Here is an excerpt from the story.
4 of the British captives were sitting on a litter of straw, heads in their hands. What could they be thinking of? One thing could be seen, that their faces were pale and their features drawn. What tortures had they been forced to submit to? Only Cyrus Paltons seemed to have kept all of his energy and willpower. As he stood in an impudent, combative attitude, his blue eyes gazed around with a bantering and provocative look. Not knowing how near help was, and perhaps even rescue, informed of his impending fate by those who had preceded him into captivity, he didn't tremble. "You have us, dog," he cried to the master of the mysterious valley. "Yes, you have us. But what about all the Englishmen who will come after us, and who, no matter what you do, will know how to beat you and wipe you out any time they choose? You aren't a lion. You're a jackal, and you'll hide yourself if our armies penetrate into this valley, which isn't a kingdom, but a bandit's hideout. Go. Be gone with you. You may torture our bodies, but you cannot abase us."
As this exciting adventure story continues, Paltons draws upon his courage and his wit to free himself and his friends from imprisonment. He overcomes enemies and traitors and narrowly escapes any number of dangers, including cobras and crocodiles, and to boot, he rescues a beautiful Englishwoman along the way before riding off into safety. So why have we started with this story, with this character of Cyrus Paltons? Well, our talk today is about reading, and we encourage you to ask yourself, what impact might this have on a child to discover this character in her reading? What does this story offer her? Let's look at the impact it had on one particular child, a child of 9 years of age. In a 1962 interview, Ayn Rand was asked about what influences from her childhood impacted her desire to become a writer. Ms. Rand said, and I quote, "The first thing that impressed me very much, and I am not emotionally indifferent to this day, was an adventure story called The Mysterious Valley. It had an enormous impact on me because it presented in complete form the sort of man I could admire. It was just an adventure, British officers in India, but written in a very heroic way. I mean heroic in my sense, not brutes, but men of ingenuity and intelligence. No work of literature has ever impressed me quite that much." That's quite a statement. No work of literature has ever impressed me quite that much. So this image of heroism had a profound impact on the young Ayn Rand. And maybe some of you sitting in the audience were lucky enough to encounter childhood stories that had made a similar impression on you. And undoubtedly, for many of you in the audience, discovering Ayn Rand's own works of fiction when you were teenagers or young adults had a profound and even life-changing impact.
We're here today because we care deeply about reading. We want our children to be enriched by fiction, by literature, by poetry. We want them to learn from nonfiction, to access the wisdom and knowledge that mankind has discovered across the ages and around the globe. But becoming a reader is not an automatic process, even in a literate society. Later, we'll look at reading trends in our modern culture and how rare it is that young people these days read. The fact is, many of them are not becoming readers. Maybe you are here because you have children or grandchildren, or you're thinking about your future children, and you want to know what you can do because of this trend. Or perhaps you have a more general interest in the culture, and you want to know what we can do to reverse the tide, which has been happening.
And we're so gratified that you're here to explore this important topic with us, and particularly given that we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Romantic Manifesto. So we'd like to tell you just a little bit about ourselves and our background, which inform our knowledge of this topic. So I'm Lindsay Journo, the proud mother of 2 avid readers, Callista, age 11, and Tristan, age 8. Here they are. I've worked in the field of education for over 20 years and have taught every level from preschool through 12th grade in a variety of settings, traditional, gifted, Montessori. In my most recent role, I've developed a literature curriculum for 6 to 12-year-olds for Guidepost Montessori, which is a family of schools operated by Higher Ground Education, the company that we helped found.
I'm Cornelia Lockitch, and similar to Lindsay, my background is in Montessori education. I have a AMI diploma at both the 3 to 6 and 6 to 12 age levels, and I've taught across those ages for more than 10 years, both in the classroom and as a tutor. I have put what I learned into practice with my own 2 children, and I'm happy to report that they are highly enthusiastic readers. Here they are in a typical pose, ready to leave the house, books in hand. And right now, I've been working for the past several years as Director of Prepared Environment at Higher Ground Education. You'll learn a little bit about that, Prepared Environments, in just a few minutes. So,
I have to throw in that if you're worried that we've actually locked you in a room to just show you pictures of our children, you should be really afraid.
Before diving into how to nurture young readers, we're going to look at why reading is so important for children. For nonfiction, the benefits are pretty obvious. Children acquire knowledge and thinking skills as they read and they write, and they learn how to turn information that they gain into their own understanding. We know that reading is an integral part of functioning in daily life, and that it is essential for almost any job in our high-tech age. But what about fiction, which is the focus of our talk today? What is it about the nature of the developing child and about the nature of fiction and literature in particular that makes reading so essential to his development?
So to begin to answer this question, I'd like to explore 2 quotes, one by Ayn Rand and one by Maria Montessori. So Ayn Rand wrote that man is a being of self-made soul. And Maria Montessori wrote that the child, making use of all that he finds around him, shapes himself for the future. These quotes speak to similar themes, that the child is in the process of self-construction, of self-creation, and the most important thing that he is creating is his own soul. And I mean this not in a mystical sense, but in the sense of developing his character, his values, his core identity. Children are developing their subconscious sense of self. They're forming their earliest implicit answers to questions like, what kind of person do I want to become? Who do I admire? What's important to me? What am I willing to fight for? And at the same time, the child is developing his subconscious conclusions about the world around him, right? Does this world make sense? Is it a place where I can achieve my values, or is it a place where I can expect to be thwarted at every turn? Is it even worth trying? None of us is born with these implicit conclusions about the world or about ourselves. They develop over time. And where does the child gather the concrete evidence to form these conclusions? As Maria Montessori wrote, he makes use of all that he finds around him. And clearly that includes the child's own life experiences, but it also includes the art that he finds around him, the literature, the poetry, the painting, the music, and so on. In quality literature, what children are offered is the stylized hero, whose every word and action and decision is tailored to heighten the drama of his struggle, the import of his virtues, and the meaning of his victory. In literature, children can experience vividly and concretely, this is the kind of person I can become. This is the kind of triumph and success that's possible to me in the world. Literature offers children that emotional experience of looking up to a hero and the image of a world where that hero can succeed. And this experience is an end in itself. And to this point, I love the artwork that's pictured here, and also the caption. It takes a library to raise a child. And so I love that too. So what would a child experience concretely and dramatically with some of these iconic storybook characters? Who do we have here? Well, we have the lion, Aslan, from the Chronicles of Narnia, a fierce leader whose strict moral compass impels him to fight for the powers of good over evil, even at the cost of his own life. We have the orphan, Anne of Green Gables, whose fiery spirit and intelligence and independence help her carve her own path in a new world. Or what about the wisdom of Gandalf, right? The wizard from The Hobbit, who has the insight to see the potential in a friend, even if his friend is just a homely little hobbit, before his friend sees it in himself. And there are many more. The caption says, it takes a library to raise a child. So when children are presented with this library of characters, they're given a rich banquet of resources for their own self-development. And it is important to note that this library does need to be curated. So you can ask me about that in the question period. One reason why literature is able to have such a formative impact on children is because it's concrete. It's specific characters in particular settings. The child is being shown, not told. We are not presenting children with didactic lectures on the virtues or an abstract textbook on philosophy. Children learn by progressing from the concrete to the abstract. And in fact, this is one of the central tenets of the Montessori approach to education.
So for instance, in mathematics, Montessori teachers don't begin by teaching young children abstract concepts like 10 tens is 100 or 10 hundreds make 1,000 when they don't actually understand what is 1,000. Instead, we begin by giving them concrete materials that they can hold and touch and see. The 10 bar, the 100 square, the 1,000 cube. These are the concrete materials on which abstractions can later be formed. Literature presents not the concrete materials of mathematics, of course, but a concretization of human nature, of the most significant human conflicts, of what is possible to man in this world, according to that author. Just as other Montessori materials make grammar or geometry concrete, so literature concretizes an author's view of human beings and the world around us.
And you might be wondering if this is where the impact of literature begins and ends for children, right? So they have this concrete experience, which contributes to forming implicit premises. It offers spiritual fuel, that emotional experience, and that's it, right? As Ankar and Yaron discussed yesterday, this aesthetic experience is an end in itself. And that is true, but it is also true that the adult can play a vital role in helping the child to understand fully what she has read and to conceptualize it. We can help the child take in what she has experienced as a particular and to guide her to see what is universal. This process lends an even greater clarity to the child's experience. It helps the child form explicit principles that can, over the years, become her moral compass. So just to give one brief example, this past month at one of our Guidepost Montessori schools, the 7 and 8-year-olds were reading a story called Trumpet of the Swan by E.B. White. So for those of you who haven't read it, this story is about a trumpeter swan named Louis, who's born without a voice. He's completely mute. And this handicap poses really a potentially crushing hurdle for Louis because he is in love with another swan named Serena, and he cannot win her over without a voice, without being able to make that trumpeting call that he needs to do. So Louis's father tries to help him by stealing an actual trumpet for Louis. But Louis just doesn't feel right about it. So Louis sets out on a series of adventures in the world to solve his problem. He goes to school to learn to read and write until he figures out, of course, the other swans can't read and write, so that didn't help. He becomes a musician so that he can earn money to keep the trumpet honestly and to win Serena's heart. So children love this story. They delight in Louis's unusual adventures. The teacher's job is to help the children conceptualize the particular concretes of the story. So as just one example, a teacher might ask the children, well, why doesn't Louis just accept the trumpet? Solves all of his problems, doesn't it? With these kinds of questions and the discussion that ensues, the adult can help the child identify motivation. So why do characters do what they do? And to conceptualize the traits that earn the characters his values, traits like integrity, ingenuity, perseverance, traits that help not only Louis, but all of us in our lives. And so that way, children walk away not only with that inspiring vision of Louis's character, but also the concepts to identify what it represents. With the guidance of a skilled teacher, children are developing the tools to judge human behavior and its consequences, and the ability to conceptualize their conclusions. And this is invaluable in developing a life-affirming, explicit morality.
Lindsay's been discussing the life-enhancing payoff that literature provides children and adults. Consider the impact that Ayn Rand's writings have had on you. Both the inspiration of encountering a character like Dagny Taggart and the understanding of what she represents. Let's pause for a moment to consider what it took to reap the benefit out of Alice Shrugged. What it took to get you to a place where a 1,000-page novel profoundly moved you. First, you needed to have the will, the desire to pick that book up and see it through. You had to believe it would be a worthwhile and enjoyable use of your time. An Ayn Rand novel can be pretty daunting. A lot of people don't finish them. You had to be motivated enough to put in the active effort to grasp its meaning. Most fundamentally, you had to choose to read instead of choosing to do something else. Secondly, you needed the skill. You needed the thinking skills to integrate the events of the story, infer from its clues, and apply all of these to your understanding of your own life and the world. You needed to possess sustained focus across long-form text, the vocabulary to understand its references, and at the most basic level, the ability to decode the words on the page. In other words, you had to be a reader. A reader has both the will and the skill for reading books fluently and with full comprehension. The will and the skill constantly reinforce one another. If a person doesn't have the foundational skills, she will experience a lifelong struggle at reading, and a staggering number of adults do struggle with reading. Conversely, if she doesn't have the will, the skill doesn't matter very much. If you know how to brush your teeth, but you never do, it doesn't do you much good. If you have the skills to read, but never choose reading as your preferred activity, you will never become a reader. To nurture young people to be readers, we need to cultivate these two things, the will and the skill. So in the rest of our talk, we're going to look at the development of both of these vital components to a love of reading. But first, Lindsay's going to talk briefly at the current state of reading in our culture.
Yes, sure, because I really think that looking at what's happening to reading in our culture helps to underscore the importance of our role in nurturing young readers. So let's have a look first at the will, at the desire to read. So there's a plethora of studies that analyze how teens and children are using their discretionary time these days. The one that I've highlighted here is Trends in U.S. Adolescents Media Use from 1976 to 2016. It was published by the American Psychological Association. So these researchers looked at over 1 million teens across 40 years, 4 decades. It's pretty depressing. I hope that you can make it out over there. That top line that you see there is the percentage of 12th grade students who read 2 or more books for pleasure in this past year. And to be clear, by books, I don't just mean print editions. That includes electronic books on e-readers and so on. So as you can see there, the number fell by almost a third, from 78% in 1976 to 51% in 2016. And don't get too excited by that bottom line there. You see the one that's really rapidly increasing, because that is actually the percentage of students who did not read any books for pleasure in the past year. That went from fairly low 12% in 1976 all the way up to 34% in 2016. So let that sink in for a moment. That's fully a third of teenagers who are not picking up Atlas Shrugged or The Fountainhead or anything else for that matter. And if you're interested, I have some similar statistics for younger readers as well you can ask me about in the question period. So this is a glimpse at what is happening to the will to read in our country. And what about the skill? What would happen if we literally locked children in a room and required them to read? How would they perform? How would they do? We know the answer to that question because that's what we do when we perform standardized tests, right? So let's have a look. This is from the NAEP. So it's based on a standardized test that's very widely delivered in public and private schools across the country. And you can see the different reading levels there. 4th grade is at the top. So starting in the dark green at the very bottom, you have below basic, which indicates the child has little or no mastery of fundamental reading skills. The next one up is basic, indicates partial mastery of fundamental reading skills. You then have proficiency, which indicates competency, and the little tiny light green sliver at the top, which is advanced, which indicates superior performance. So if you add up the numbers there for 2017, what you'll see is that 36% of students scored proficient or above. So who does that leave behind? That means that fully 63% of our 4th graders, almost 2/3, are not achieving proficiency in reading. And the results are very similar at 8th grade and 12th grade as well. So this little glimpse, I think, gives you some insight into the fact that the majority of students are lacking the will to read and the skills to read. Why should you care? Well, I think that any of us who really care about human flourishing should care about literacy because it affects every one of us directly or indirectly. As a culture, if our children are uninterested in or unable to read the writings of past thinkers and artists, then I think we have little hope of preserving the freedom and rationality and individualism that America is based on. And on an individual level, this matters for the children in your life. The status quo is not working for our children. We all want our children to benefit from that library of characters that we saw earlier, but all signs point to the need as parents, grandparents, educators, or just concerned individuals to take action and to take it early on, ideally right from birth.
How do we develop a deep-rooted motivation to read? How do we make it more appealing than even screen time? How do we make it so it's something the child chooses to do? Especially as we've seen that most children are not choosing to read. The easiest way to develop a love of reading is to set the right conditions from the very beginning, before any precedents have been set or any potential negatives introduced. As Montessorians, we believe strongly in the power of a prepared environment. A prepared environment is a meticulously curated space designed for a special purpose, such as a lab for doing chemistry or a hair salon for doing hair. A prepared environment for children is a space where everything it contains, both the physical and the intangible aspects, facilitates his learning and overall development. How you choose to set up the physical space in your home, what you do to promote reading, and what you do to indirectly prepare your child to one day be a reader are all facets of your prepared environment. So here are 3 things you can do to create an environment that nurtures reading. You can make books available. It's not controversial, but it's not done by many people. You can make reading a focus of spending time together. And create a language-rich environment. The first 2 are points that apply to children of any age. The last is particular to younger children in their phase of language acquisition. So let's look at each one briefly. From the earliest age, you are going to want to set up your space at home or in a classroom, if you are in a classroom, so that books are low enough for a child to reach. Most parents don't do this because they think, well, he can't read anyway, or we don't want him getting into the books. But children are excellent observers, and every time that and by putting books within his reach, you will maximize the benefit of your daily reading routine. He's going to watch you take those books off the shelf when it's reading time, and he's going to want to do the same one day when he can do so. Have you ever noticed how beautifully inviting the covers of children's picture books are? So in both of these pictures, you can see we have a forward-facing book display. This is one of the best things you can buy your child if you're thinking ahead, or your grandchild if you have someone in mind. They bring forward the covers of books and they beckon the child to take them off the shelf and flip through them. On your book display, only put out a few books, 8, 12 books maybe. More is not better. You want a small selection at any given time. You don't need a lot of money. You don't need a huge library. You just need a library at home. You can borrow from the local library. A limited quantity of books is actually better for children under 6. Fewer books means less overwhelm, and it means a stronger relationship with each one. From noticing the details in the illustrations to discovering the hidden meaning in a story. For children who are older, a regular bookshelf and an expanding library are a plus. Here are 2 pictures from one of our elementary Montessori classrooms at Guidepost Montessori. Elementary age children and teenagers are typically great collectors, and it's important for them to express their values through those collections. And a book collection is one that you definitely want to encourage. Whatever your child's age, complete the space with soft seating and good lighting. And as you can see, older children like to sprawl their bodies this way and that's all good. You're going to want to make reading a focus of spending time together. As early as a few weeks of age, read short books or passages to your child. It is literally never too late to start reading to your child. He's mostly going to be interested in the sound of your voice and the sounds of language, and that's okay. It's also never too late to start reading to your child. As I'll discuss later when we cover the skills needed for reading, reading aloud to your child and with your child, that is you and he taking turns, are really impactful ways to engage a reluctant or a struggling reader. Whenever it is that you start reading to your child, do it regularly, schedule it in if necessary, make it special one-on-one time, and be fully present. Turn off your cell phone. Don't get distracted by digital alerts, as is so easy to do. Children thrive on consistency, and they also crave one-on-one time with you. Reading together is a powerful way to give them all that while also fostering that love of reading. Every time you sit down to enjoy a book with your baby, your toddler, your preschooler, or your 12-year-old, you're not only making memories, but you're forging a subconscious association between reading and deep comfort. In doing so, you're going to be building an emotional connection with reading. And that is something the child will carry with him, and that is a powerful motivator during the work of learning to read. In all these ways, you're showing your child through your choices and actions that reading is important. Similarly, yeah,
we do find that it's really important that your child sees you read, as this, I think, really clever comic shows. And seeing you read, I think, physical books rather than tablets or screens, partly because it's so easy, especially for younger children, to confuse, seeing you on a tablet with you doing other non-reading related activities. And I can't tell you how many times I've been stopped in the grocery store when I'm out and about with my children and have other parents stop me and say, your kids are reading. How did you do that? And I actually think a big part of the answer is they see me reading. They've seen me reading over the years, and they see that it's a real value of mine, that it's something that, grown-ups do. And I think that quote is so true, that your children are watching what you do, and they are going to imitate it. And so your children seeing you read is really important in their development. So we've looked at making books available, and we've looked at making them a focus of your time together, and also the importance of you modeling reading in front of your children or grandchildren. Now we're going to turn briefly to look at how to create a language-rich environment for children.
Barring a cognitive disorder, there is no stopping a child's absorbent mind in its work of developing his capacity to understand words and to speak them. But the quality of a child's language abilities can vary dramatically. They might be limited and imprecise, or rich and articulate. How do you help your child achieve the latter? One way is to view every book as an opportunity to explore language. From the earliest age, share rhyming books and books that play with language, like Mr. Brown Can Moo. Can you? It's no accident that so many children's books rhyme. Rhymes are very important for isolating the sounds of language, which we'll see later is a crucial pre-reading skill. At the same time, books you read can be a notch or two above your child's present vocabulary. It's okay for him not to grasp everything at once that's in them. That's why we reread books and pause to explain. That's why we connect something from the book with something else in the child's experience. Provide your child with real-life experiences that connect his developing vocabulary with the real world. There's not much point in reading books about animals if he never gets the chance to actually pet a dog or watch a butterfly flutter by. If you spend time around children, then you know that they operate at a different pace to us adults. You've likely heard the advice to slow down when you're with them, because in order to connect with children and provide the right kind of support to them, it's up to us to fit to their pace. All of this is true, but I'd like to add to that advice of slowing down to add words to it. This means tell stories about everyday things, just things you do together. This might sound mundane, but it's pretty exciting stuff for a child who is 18 months, 2, 3, 4 years old. I might say to my 2-year-old, if I had one here, we pressed the button in the elevator and it brought us downstairs. Look at all the people sitting for the lecture. The air conditioning is making it nice and cool in here, isn't it? Basic stuff, exciting for young children. Experiences and the words to describe them give words meaning. Simple stories help a young child construct the sequential chain of an event in his thinking and build his vocabulary. How does this relate to reading? A strong vocabulary helps a child have a rich frame of reference for the trial and error that is involved when decoding unfamiliar words. If you are a beginner reader trying to sound out asparagus, for example, but you've never heard the word and don't know what it means, you lack the context to determine if your decoding is right or wrong. Vocabulary, together with a child's general knowledge of the world, gives him the ability to apply his higher level thinking skills to what he's reading. And this is what launches him into the realm of a sophisticated reader, what's described by Montessorians as total reading.
So Cornelia has been talking about all the ways you can set the scene for your child to develop a love of reading. Let's pause just for a minute and look at what could get in the way. So what could the barriers be to a child developing the reading habit? Because we believe that every child has the potential to become a passionate reader. But it does take some conscious preparation and decision-making on the part of parents or grandparents or educators, particularly because, as we've seen, we're swimming against the cultural tide. So in looking at motivation and the will to read, what might be barriers to developing the reading habit? Well, recall for a minute the research that we were looking at earlier about the decline in teens' reading habits over the past 4 decades. Did you wonder which activities are replacing reading? Right? What are the teens doing in these hours that they used to be reading? Who has a guess? Yep. Video games? Anyone else? Watching videos? Yep. Say it again. TV? Instagram? Yeah, you're actually, yep. Facebook. There we go. I'm going to take the 2 in the front row here. The answer is overwhelmingly they're on social media. Okay? The biggest competitor for our children's attention and discretionary time is screens. Not only social media, but also TV, movies, video games, YouTube, and so on. And to be clear, I am not coming out completely against teens using social media. There are lots of benefits in terms of staying connected to friends and family and getting quick news updates and just for fun, cat videos and so on. And it's also the case that not all screen time is created equal, right? There's a huge difference between watching a documentary about something that you're interested in versus playing hours and hours of Fortnite, or between Skyping with a relative you care about versus scrolling mindlessly through Instagram. For youngsters, screens are so engaging and they are so immersive and they're so easy that they're going to typically win out over reading every time, right? In contrast to social media or video games, reading is a slow, low stimulus, cognitively effortful activity. You do not have sights and sounds flashing at you every minute. You do not have immediate gratification every time somebody likes one of your posts, right? Youngsters who spend all of their time on screens never have the chance to develop the reading habit and their love of reading. And most of the screen time is not going to offer the spiritual fuel that literature provides or the depth and breadth of information that long-form nonfiction gives you. And so I do think that the onus is on us as educators, parents, relatives, to be thoughtful about how much time our children are spending in front of screens, especially when they're very young. We need to plan ahead. As Cornelia was mentioning, look at our daily and weekly schedules and think about what limits we might need to put into place to carve out time for other activities like reading. Another barrier, which I see as to developing the reading habit, is what I refer to as ill-considered rewards. So you've probably heard of a multitude of programs that give you, free pizza if you read a pizza party, if you read a certain number of books, or at school, class ice cream party if everybody reads 10 pages a night, or the very, very widely used accelerated reader program, AR for short, which is an online program that gives children rewards through points for the number of books they read and the number of multiple choice quizzes that they pass after they read each book. So there are nuanced situations where short-term incentives might make sense as a stopgap, maybe for a child to get over a particular hump or challenge, maybe with an older child who's a struggling or reluctant reader. But in general, I have seen that the proper approach to reading at home and at school just eliminates the need for any kind of rewards. Children are smart. They know that these kind of rewards are typically for something that is not pleasurable or fun, right? Do you get rewards for watching TV? Do you get rewards for eating candy or jumping on the bed? No. So why do you need rewards for reading? When we do so, my concern is that we're framing reading as something that is not inherently valuable or enjoyable. And furthermore, we really do run the risk of rewards becoming perverse incentives, of backfiring and achieving unintended results. To quote Alfie Kohn, who's a writer in the field of education, he writes that what matters more than the fact that children are reading is why they read and how they read. And with incentive-based programs, as the data clearly indicates, the answer to why is to get rewards. And the answer to how, meanwhile, at least with programs like Accelerated Reader, is superficially. So they're skimming the book to get the facts they need for the quiz, and they're choosing shorter, simpler books just so that they can rack up more titles. So this is definitely not the authentic interest in reading that we're going for. So what to do? Let's send the message to our children that reading is valuable in and of itself. Let's follow some of the tips that Cornelia shared about how to engender a genuine, deep love of reading. And it does begin with what we model. We can send the right message to our children by living it ourselves.
A third barrier to motivation can stem from a failure to look at each child as an individual reader, hence the cookie cutter. There are no cookie cutter children. We run the risk of squashing a child's interest in reading if we make him read books that are too difficult for him, not suited for his developmental stage, or just aren't of interest to him. First, children need to have books that match their current skill level and developmental stage. Pushing your child to slog through works that are too challenging is going to be a motivation killer for free reading. Similarly, pay attention to your child's maturity level. Children under 12, typically uninterested in works with romantic themes. On the flip side, young adults who are just starting to venture out into the world, they love stories that focus on independence, like the book Hatchet, for example. Second, pay attention to your child's burgeoning individual interests and let them have a voice in choosing and abandoning stories. Does your child love horses, outer space, cars, sports? You can help your child milk their values and develop their reading habit all at the same time. But what if you're a few chapters in, especially into a book that you love and you think your child should love, but he doesn't? Well, as hard as that might be, let it go. Let him abandon it. I usually ask my children to give it a few chapters. As many books, they can be a little slow to ramp up. But if you're a third or halfway through and he's not interested, let him stop. We want to send a strong message to our children that this is fun and then they have freedom and choice as readers and that their developing literary tastes matter.
And you might be thinking that this kind of freedom and choice sounds well and good, right? Letting your child develop their individual literary preferences. But what if they choose junk for their free reading? What do you do then? Well, I think it takes a judgment call, right? If the book is truly offensive or violent or mature in a way that's just wildly inappropriate for your child, I think a parent has a right to explain that to their child and to prohibit exposure to that book, at least until the child is older, the same way that you would with a TV show or with a movie. I mean, remember what Yuran commented on, I think it was yesterday. Let's limit the cultural carbon monoxide that our children are being exposed to. But if the book is just, maybe you find it superficial or maybe you find it mildly distasteful, then you have a decision to make. So for example, at one point in time, my children were drawn to a series of books called Diary of a Wimpy Kid, which they found funny, but I personally couldn't stand because I found it really sarcastic and cynical, was not a favorite. So what I opted to do was to just make sure that this wasn't all or even most of what my children were reading. So if my child chose that title for our read together time before bed, I might say, okay, great. Well, it's going to be my turn to choose the book next time. Or I would talk to my children about the book. I would ask them questions about the main character to get them thinking a little bit more critically about him. If my child wanted to buy that series from the bookstore, I might say, I don't really feel like that's valuable enough to spend my money on, but you can get it from the library if you want to. So in short, rather than turn into the book police in this kind of a situation, I'd prefer to, talk with my child about the book, maybe limit exposure and continue to steer them toward more enriching choices. And again, we're happy to talk this through more in the question period. And just to wrap up this discussion of motivation, I don't want any of you to despair if you have a child in your life who is not yet a motivated reader and feel like you've missed the boat, because there's always something you can do. If you have an older child who doesn't want to read aloud together in the way that Cornelia described, maybe that child would be willing to listen to audiobooks with you in the car. Or maybe she'll be willing to take a trip to Barnes & Noble with you if there's a decaf latte in it for her. Maybe some short-term incentives are what is needed for an older or reluctant reader to get them over a hump. And maybe, just maybe, if you designate an hour or two of screen-free time after dinner, your child will get just bored enough to pick up that book that you've left strategically placed on the coffee table, and maybe we'll start reading that way.
Now let's switch from the will to the skill. In a short talk, we can't possibly tell you how to teach a child to read, but what we'd like to do is present 4 pillars on which reading rests. Unlike learning to talk, learning to read is not effortless for a child. Reading involves specialized skills that need to be practiced and developed and automatized over time. By understanding and embracing these 4 pillars, we can make that work easier. So what are they? Develop phonemic awareness. Here you go. Focus on letter sounds, not letter names. Develop decoding skills, not memorizing. And listen to your child read until at least age 10. Let's talk about phonemic awareness first. It may come as a surprise that the most consistent predictor of a child's reading success happens long before he's at the stage of learning his letters. Phonemic awareness means the ability to discern the individual sounds in that smooth flow of words that makes up oral language. It means the ability to hear, for example, that dog is made up of 3 sounds, d, ah, g. Phonemic awareness is a hugely overlooked area of skill development in reading education, even by proponents of phonics. And yet it is absolutely foundational for the skill of reading. When we train the ear to hear the sounds that make up our speech, we prepare it to connect written letters to those sounds. What can you do as a parent or maybe a teacher to develop strong phonemic awareness in a child? All right, so what can you do? You're going to play sound games. Sound games, for example, are games like this. Short, little oral games. They don't require any special material or anything. I spy with my little eye something that starts with the sound That's sound comparison. Or, how many sounds do you hear in sand? That's segmentation. What word do the sounds p, et form? That's blending. By playing these sorts of sound games on a regular basis, you are giving your child something to hook his letters onto when he learns them. I really can't overstate this. Children who cannot break apart spoken words into phonemes will not be able to link letters to sounds. Something that we as Montessorians do differently from mainstream phonics is to introduce the sounds of letters before letter names. Letter names do nothing to help a child learn to read. In our experience, they actually add a layer of confusion between the child and letter sounds. For example, when you're reading the word wag, you don't need to know that the first letter is W. You just need to know that it makes the sound W. Once a child is on the road to fluency around first grade or so, letter names can be introduced to facilitate alphabetizing and spelling. But before that, unfortunately, for many, many children, it is a cliche of the preschool classroom for them to sing the alphabet song and learn letter names. You can omit this altogether at home with your children. The best resource we know of for connecting sounds to their letter shapes are the sandpaper letters invented by Maria Montessori. This is an iconic Montessori material in which the child slowly traces the letter with his index and middle fingers while saying the sound of that letter. So, for example, S. This action connects the letter shape, both visually and how it's written, to the sound. Practice with sandpaper letters builds reading and writing skills at the same time and in a multisensory way. Which sounds do we introduce first? English is one of the more complex phonetic languages, so it is important to be really systematic. Let's address this with the next pillar, developing decoding skills.
And before we get into the specific sounds and their order, we just want to take a moment to talk about decoding skills because children must be given the keys to unlock the code that is our written language. They need to know what all of the letter combinations stand for in English. And for some of you, if this isn't kind of your field of expertise, it might surprise you that this is actually a really contentious issue. For those of you who aren't aware, I'm going to tell you just a little bit about the two camps in what is called the reading wars. You wouldn't think you could have a war over this, but you can. So, knowing the English code enables children to decipher any written word. Without that, children cannot be fully independent readers. This is the guiding principle of the reading method known as phonics. So phonics is the systematic presentation of the English code. Phonics can be contrasted with the other camp, whole language. The whole language approach is one in which the child receives little or no direct instruction on letter-sound relationships. Advocates of whole language will argue that English is just too contradictory and phonics is too boring to be taught explicitly. They believe that children will pick up the letter-sound relationship just with repeated exposure to printed material and with the help of context clues. Now, I'm not going to discount context clues. Strong vocabulary and general knowledge are important aids in learning to read. But in practice, what whole language leads to is a whole lot of memorizing and guessing and very uncertain readers. So, for example, in whole language, a child may not be taught explicitly that the letter O and the letter U, when they're put together, can make the sound ow. But let's say you have a child who has some skill in at least seeing the initial sound of a word. So in the sentence, I looked with interest at my friend's new house, he might just as easily read, I looked with interest at my friend's new horse. Or, I looked with interest at my friend's new hose. Context clues they're simply not enough to support a child in accurate reading. So example, we were talking about Shakespeare in the general session this morning. Shakespeare's corpus, I believe, has almost 30,000 different words. There is no way a child can memorize all of them. They need the key that unlocks our language, and that key is letter-sound relationships. So the good news is that in recent years, research-based phonics programs have gained momentum. They really have. In fact, one state, I think it's Arkansas, has recently said they will only give funds to schools that are using research-based phonics programs. The bad news is that whole language is still a lingering influence, and that what's happened is many, many schools have decided on a compromise approach that they call balanced literacy, which is really a mishmash of some phonics and some whole language.
Okay, back to decoding. We all know that English is less straightforward than other phonetic languages, with words like through and cough to trip us up. So, what do you need to know to help a young reader conquer its complexities? There's sort of a basic progression that we can talk about here. There are 44 sounds in English for a child to learn to recognize both orally and in graphic form. 44. That's a good number, but it's definitely finite. We begin with the most common sounds, basically the ones that have a one-to-one correspondence with the 26 letters of the alphabet, like ah and zzz. Then we turn to the remaining 18 sounds. Now, these are the more complex ones that are made of combinations of letters, otherwise known as digraphs or phonograms. Ow, j, for example. Where a young reader is likely to get tripped up is with the vowel digraphs. There are so many ways to make the same vowel sounds in English, and it can seem pretty incomprehensible to a young reader. For many, this is exactly where the work of reading really kicks in and where that background motivation we talked about earlier really comes into play. So how can we make this a little simpler for a child? One thing we can do is reduce the multiplicity of all those variations for the young reader. We can show him that the same sound can simply be represented in a few different ways. So for example, just like a flower can be represented by a tulip or a rose or a sunflower, or face can be represented with many different expressions, the sound A can be represented by A silent E, AY, or EIGH. When we emphasize the common sounds among letter combinations, children have an easier time retaining them and applying them when they decode. Even with all this, it's true that some words in English are what we call puzzle words that must be memorized because their spelling just doesn't make any sense. But this is very limited. Words like are, once, they, and so on. All right. Finally, once your child can read at the sentence level, it can be tempting to feel that your job is done. You've succeeded. Your child is a reader. Well, almost. Until about third grade, Most children are still learning to read. From 4th grade onward, by contrast, they read to learn. What this means is that the difficulty of the reading material your child encounters increases steadily from 4th grade. And the variety of words he must learn to decode, including many, many more irregular words, becomes huge. So you have to keep an eye on this. It's a critical time during which your child's reading vocabulary must keep pace. The only way to ensure that your child is reading with correct pronunciation and increasing fluency is to listen to him read aloud regularly. Practice at reading and rereading aloud is what builds those fast-paced neural connections necessary for that rapid and automatic word recognition. It actually takes about 10 times of correctly decoding a word before a child's skill evolves from that halting sounding out to the lightning fast recognition of whole words. This is the practice that children need, not just more silent reading. If you would like some tips on how to listen to a child read, a child who's learning to read, you can ask me afterwards. As with motivation, it is never too late to help a struggling reader. The process is the same at every age, but older children do need more intense intervention and possibly by a reading specialist. So we recommend the Orton-Gillingham approach, and we have specific OG programs that we can refer you to if you're interested in knowing about them. Wondering which books are good ones for your child to read? Well, we are thrilled to report that there are many more wonderful books out there than your children will ever have time for. On our recommended reading list, we have included just some sample titles that we've seen many children enjoy. But of course, there are no cookie cutter children, so you'll have to, see what he or she likes. You can find them at this URL if you want to jot it down or take a picture. So we have hoped to show you in our talk today that reading and literature in particular can have a life-changing, life-enhancing impact. It did on the young Ayn Rand, and it did on all of us. But we cannot take for granted that the children we care about will become readers. We play a vital role in helping children develop the will and the skill to become lifelong readers. We hope that some of our tips and recommendations will help you develop strategies and confidence so that you can nurture the reader in every child.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. So I'm soon to have an emerging reader on my hands, so I would like to hear the tips you had for listening to children read.
Sure, yes. Let's see. Be patient.
Yes.
That's important. Again, you need time, and they need the time to stumble, if necessary, and try out different decodes, if you will. That's not really a word, but patient. Don't jump in too quickly. Some gentle correction is useful, but the practice is more important than the perfect. And I would add, quit while you're ahead.
Yes.
It's much, much more impactful to read for short periods of time every day than to, oh my gosh, we haven't read in 7 days. Let's do it all on Sunday night. Mm-hmm. So, did you want to add anything?
Sure. Yes. It's good to, as Cornelia said, quit when you're ahead. See, you want to build enjoyment. So it's much better to have a shorter session and leave your child wanting a little bit more than to go too long until they're exhausted and kind of want to quit. So really good to judge how your child is doing.
All right, be patient with me now. I have some confusion, or I'd like some enlightenment about Montessori. My understanding is that Montessori went from 3rd grade to 6th grade and stopped there. and that it is more perceptual than conceptual. Now, obviously, Montessori goes on through 8th grade, at least, not just your schools, but any Montessori school. So what is the distinction between perception and conception? And how did Montessori evolve from Maria Montessori to what it is now?
That's
I mean,
a
the
great
short
question.
answer.
We can say a few things about it. She actually wrote for all the planes of development from birth to what she thought was a cusp of adulthood. So from 0 to 24, actually. The vast majority of her work was spent on ages 3 to 6. So that's where you see really the majority of the materials she developed, the majority of writings that she had. She did, though, have some pointers and indication for what you should do right through middle school and high school. And we can get into that maybe more one-on-one if you're interested. In terms of, the perceptual and the conceptual, I think she had a view very similar to Aristotle's, which is all of the information that you gather is going to first come through the senses. And so that's why she developed materials in mathematics, sensorial materials, language materials that the child can understand and explore concretely, and that the abstractions that the child forms are going to be based on those sensorial experiences. But if you want to talk, we can talk Montessori all day. So if anyone has questions about Montessori, we'd be happy to answer them in more detail.
Thank you so much for your talk. I have a quick question, and I know that I work with kids of different ages and I nanny, and I try to, and I would love to believe that everybody reads like I do, and every family does, but that's not the case. So trying to get children interested in reading, and I know that you mentioned like audiobooks and different things like that. My concern is it triggers different points of the brain. So physical reading versus audio reading. And what are your thoughts on that? Like, how is it, is it important to do both at the same time? I think that's, I've done that with younger children where they have the audiobooks that they can read along. What are your thoughts on audiobooks
that's a great question.
being combined as well?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we were just talking about that. Do you want to jump in
I can
first?
start on that. Sure. I think that audiobooks can be a wonderful way to hook children into books. And if families that you nanny for example, don't have reading as a really central part of their lifestyle, I think a flaw with audiobooks is that the story just keeps going, and you might still be back, a little while ago, like, what did he say? Or I want to think about that. And when you read, you stop when that happens, but audio just keeps going. So while I think they're wonderful, they're not identical or an exact replacement for reading. And I think the same thing if the book is in front of you while you're listening. You when the bell rings, you turn the page, whether you were really done with that part or not.
I can jump, piggyback on that as well.
Yeah.
I completely agree, especially for struggling readers. Audiobooks can be a wonderful motivator to show them stories can be really interesting and really engaging and fun, because it's hard work when you're struggling. Sometimes you don't get that payoff. So a wonderful motivator. Again, if you think about the complexity of the vocabulary and the complexity of a story that you can expose a child to, whether you're reading aloud or it's an audiobook, that can be really valuable for children. But exactly as Cornelia said, a lot of the thinking and the work is done in the pauses. So whether you're reading more sophisticated nonfiction or you're reading more sophisticated fiction that you want to dig into, we were just, at one of our schools, they were just studying The True Confessions of Charlotte Doyle, which is sort of in some ways a mystery. And to understand it, you have to go back and check what a character said right at the beginning. And you can't really do that with an audiobook. So wonderful motivator, wonderful enhancement, but not a replacement when you're getting into more challenging works.
And I just wanted to add that I think you could use audiobooks very well to listen to the book first and then one day go back and read the book. And that's part of rereading and being more familiar, especially for a struggling reader.
Yeah.
It helps a lot.
And I can say one more comment.
Yeah.
Also, we're not a huge fan of abridged stories. So I feel like if the child's not ready to listen to the original story or read the original story, I'd rather put it off till they're ready than really shortcut the full benefit they're going to get from the original.
So I have a 5-year-old and we're working on reading, but we're also trying to raise them to be very inquisitive, very question everything, which I was a reluctant reader and I'm not a strong, I'm not my hobby. So it's hard for me. He asks me questions when we're working on reading and letter sounds, and he'll challenge the logic behind it, which I love because that's what we want him to be, but I don't know how to respond. So how do you,
can you give an example?
Raising a little objection.
Why does it make the sound it makes?
He's like, why are C and K both make? I don't know.
That's a great question.
Yeah, and it comes up. He'll challenge me, and I don't know how to answer that with confidence.
Yeah,
and still encourage him to be asking these crazy questions.
Some things in life, that's just the way it is. We don't really have much say in the fact that C and K make, and so we just need to remember it, because it'll come in handy. I mean,
you'd have to go through the history of the English language and maybe that would be interesting to him.
I know we try so hard not to say things like just because, but I don't have good responses.
One thing I could recommend is if you have the time and inclination to dive a little bit into, an Orton Gillingham based reading program like Barton Reading. Okay. It really actually helped me to understand, why do certain syllables have a short vowel and other syllables have a long vowel? There actually is a lot of logic to English. And so if you wanted to invest in a program like Barton, you'll be amazed. Like, I now know, why, and my daughter could probably teach this, why does a C sometimes make a short sound, a hard sound, and other times a soft sound? There are actually rules.
Now you got homework for me.
Exactly, which I never knew. So if you actually want the answers, you can find them out.
When you are listening to a child read, how often should you correct them when they make a mistake?
I think that's contextual. You have to judge your child, judge how new this reading material is for him, where he is in his journey. I think on the whole, as little as possible, as long as, he's staying roughly on the right path. That's my...
Or perhaps at the end, when they're finished reading, then you can say, oh, by the way, this word should be pronounced this way.
Yeah, it really does depend on the child and the level of reading. I mean, one thing I would say is that ideally, you're pre-teaching the skills, right? So you're pre-teaching the phonics. And then you're giving a child, especially if this is a child who's learning how to read, you need to give them controlled reader books. So they need to be given books that they don't need to guess. It's really important not to establish the guessing habit. So if you've taught, at our guidepost schools, what we do is the child learns maybe about a dozen, maybe 16 letter sounds. And then they start a wonderful series that we have on our recommended reading list called Books to Remember. And it's a controlled vocabulary series. So that child is only going to encounter words that he can decode or puzzle words that he's already been introduced to. And then the child doesn't need to guess. And so if that's the case, I think you can be quite careful about helping the child to sound them out accurately. I think that it can be really problematic when a child is learning how to read if they're just given sort of any book off the shelf, and then you can't read it without guessing because you haven't had the phonics that you need to decode.
Exactly. You don't want to throw him in cold. So when he's at the stage of reading a book, there's been a lot of preparation on what's going to be in that book before he gets to that, to set him up for success ahead of time.
If you're finding that you have to do a lot of correcting, I would say, take a look at the difficulty level of the book that you have presented to that child. And then if it's sort of an older reader who's making some mistakes, sort of judge it. If it's going to put them off, you can have a little bit of a lighter touch. If there's a lot of correcting, you might want to make your reading sessions shorter.
You can always, teachers do this, and this is what we do again and again in Montessori's. We isolate the difficulty. So if you find your child there's a pattern to words that he's stumbling with, take those out and put them together in a list or a game or flashcards or some way that he can practice them in an isolated manner,
Mm-hmm.
but reading and rereading again and again is what is going to help that fluency, build that fluency.
Thanks.
Welcome.
Hi, my question is about those wonderful sandpaper letters. I was a little bit puzzled when you showed the finger tracing the S. Why is it that it's in cursive when
great
pretty much
question.
every book that I've ever read from age 3 on was all in printing, like what we see up on your slide? So how come it's in cursive?
Right. That's a big question. So,
Sure.
I
I can hop in, or would you like?
I'll start and then
Sure.
you can pick up. So we introduced cursive first because when the age that this material is introduced at, the child is very young, only about 3. So they are going to be learning primarily using these primarily for writing first. And I don't mean writing in the sense of picking up a pen and writing them. That doesn't happen for quite a long time. But writing in the sense of taking a thought from inside their head and putting that out there in the world using letters. And we do that not with a pen at this age, but with a movable alphabet. So that act of writing they will do before they can synthesize those sounds back and read what they just put down on the mat or the table that they're working at. So they will actually, we call this in Montessori, writing before reading. It's a short period, but the child has the experience of putting sounds together to put them out there and writing first before he reads. Because we write, and then they will learn pretty soon. It's pretty rapid. It's pretty amazing. They will learn how to physically write soon after. So cursive is the language of writing. We focus on cursive. The letters instead of print. Print comes later in Montessori, and the letters in cursive are curvier. They are more flowing. They are typically simpler for a child to write than the straight, hard lines of print. They also physically connect to each other to form new units of words, which is, that really makes sense once I see that they actually, physically come together to form a word.
So that helps with spacing when the child is writing.
Yeah.
And it also eliminates what can be a significant problem for many children, which is letter reversal. If you think of beads, D's, Q's, you don't have that kind of letter reversal in cursive. Right. Your pencil is always starting the same spot. It's always starting on the baseline. So when you look at letter confusion, words as units, spacing, cursive is actually a much easier and more natural place to start. Then what happens, as Cornelia mentioned, is as the child, this is actually, I think, one of the genius breakthroughs of Maria Montessori, that she did see that encoding, word building, is actually an easier skill than decoding, which is reading, which comes later. So when we do start the child then on reading, they will often have a short presentation where the teacher will show them how the cursive letter matches to the print letter. But honestly, most of the time, it's not even needed. I'm not sure how it works, but children make that association very, very easily. It's just not an issue.
Wow, that was counterintuitive and fascinating. Thank you.
Hi. Full disclaimer, I'm only 20, so I don't know too much about parenting of kids.
That's okay.
But my question is from the beginning of your talk. You talked about the kids being in social media, video games, and all that, and I completely agree. I was one of those kids. I wanted to ask, though, to play small devil's advocate, being I was one of those kids, do you find any value in the video games being there's that interactive part where instead of reading about the great minds in that adventure story, you can be that guy and interact in a video game and be not all video games are the shooty types. Is there
Yeah.
any kind of video games that you would even
Yeah.
recommend?
I've-
to
I
I've
our
don't know a
kids?
lot about video games. I'm not.
I was
good-
going to
not
say,
a
I think
good
my
person
kids,
to
my
comment
son's
on.
got his hand up. He wants to
Yes,
put
like-
the plug in for video games.
Yeah.
And I think I know what you're going to say. They really vary the way that any media really varies. I mean, something like Minecraft, I think, is incredibly creative and is really beneficial in some ways. It's some of them. That's the only one that's popping into my mind. But I do think, like any other media, there is that interactive, feature. I think some of the technological breakthroughs that are being made with things like VR have tremendous potential for studying history, where they can put you and like, here are the pyramids. I feel like I'm right there. Can be terrific.
But it all, it still comes back to there's only 24 hours in a day.
Yeah.
Right. And for the developing child, you really need to choose carefully where, help him choose where he's spending his time. Because the beginning years are the most impactful for him as a developing reader.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Is it possible for you to share with us the notes of the lecture and the slides, either via URL that you can tell us, or if you have a list with emails?
Potentially,
We
yes.
can give you an email that you...
Yeah. I mean, I
I
don't know
really
what
like
the
it if you
stands
can-
with ARIs in terms of.
We'll have to check. Yes.
We have to check to make sure
Yes.
it's okay. But
Yes.
if it is okay, what we'll do is, this is actually a folder link. So if we kind of do a little research and find out that's okay, we'll just pop that into that folder and you'll be able to access them there.
Hi.
Hi,
So
Chip.
I have a new 6-year-old, just turned 6. I think we've done everything you said. The sandpaper, OG, all the Montessori sort of pre-reading and writing. We've read to him 1 to 2 hours every day of his entire life. He loves it. He's at a point of understanding 19th century children's literature from us. He has zero interest in learning how to read. And it's driving us crazy. And his instructors have always said, children develop at different ages. Don't worry. His comprehension is excellent. But he's going into a new school. And in the school, there's an expectation that kindergarten, which is a year behind him now, they know how to read.
Yeah.
So do you have any tips on what to do? Because it's like we're doing it. I mean, he doesn't have screens.
Yeah.
There's no competing time.
Yeah.
It's just.
Yeah.
I
mean, I have some thoughts.
I have some thoughts too.
Yeah.
You can go first.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, this is sort of, I'd want to give it a little bit of thought, Chip. But off the top of my head, I mean, maybe this is a case where you do have a short-term kind of reward system. I've thought about times in my children's development where there was something that we kind of needed to do. It's not infinite. It's maybe over a kind of localized period of time, and maybe you say, we're gonna work on these skills 15 minutes a day or however long it is. This is something we're going to do. And let's kind of put a sticker on the chart. Every day we do it. And at the end, we're going to go and, have an extra karate lesson or go horseback riding that you wanted to do. Or so he might need something, a little kickstart to get the motivation. If he has been struggling and it's been hard work, sometimes children really like to see their progress through something. But I think you're right. I think it needs to be a non-negotiable to work on it. And so
And
it's
now
just
is the time.
And now is the time.
Yeah.
It's
don't lose any time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
but we can talk more maybe afterwards.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think we have
how are we doing? Do we have 1 minute?
Yeah, 1 minute.
1 minute.
Okay. I think this will be quick. I wonder if you had an opinion on Dr. Seuss. Like on one hand, it's very fun and engaging. I mean, we have young kids and they love to read it.
Yeah.
On the other hand, it's, some of it's quite nonsensical. I don't know if that's, if that hurts in a certain context or not. So just kind of curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Sure. I'll jump in. I think some Dr. Seuss is wonderful. It's got a lot of rhyme. It's incredibly engaging. And I think most of the time it's introduced far too young because it's extremely fantastical. And it's just like crazy town. But there are some that is good for younger children, and we've got some on our list. But for me, mostly it's the artwork that is personally off-putting a lot of the time. But the rhymes make up for a lot of it too. So
We can tell you some afterwards if you want some titles we like.
Yeah.
So you can kind of avoid the ones that are
Yeah.
not as appealing.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much,
thank
everyone.
you.
Thanks for watching. To help keep content like this free, consider supporting ARI by becoming a member at aynrand.org/membership.